Jan, and I'm delighted to be here. Let me just move forward quickly because I have had a number of people say, oh, where is the Skyscraper Museum? So this is where it is. It's in Lower Manhattan, the southern end of Battery Park City. And what is the Skyscraper Museum? Well, there's some two shots of our opening exhibition. You can see it's quite a contemporary space, and a space that makes everything look a lot taller because of its stainless steel floor and ceiling. So those are installations, and we do about 2 different shows a year. I'll talk a little bit in the context of my talk about what we do because we do research. And I'm a little bit of an outlier in today's lineup because I'm a historian. And I'm really delighted to be here amongst all these wonderful experts. And I'm a good listener when it comes to all the things that you do. This venue, I think, is really a great opportunity to talk about, to insert history into the conversation and to pose an idea which I think is quite obvious, vertical density, but to amplify through history some of the misconceptions, I think, about the skyscraper and some of the places where we need to put a greater emphasis. So when Anthony Wood asked me, when he showed me a kind of preliminary draft to comment on for the topic of the entire conference and said, what's missing? I said the urban part of Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So what can be added overall to this discussion? So I usually just talk, but I'm going to read this in the interest of trying to get a lot in and keep to 25 minutes. And there's a big shadow across my text here, so I'll try to do everything at the same time here. So what can be added to this discussion? In concentrating on the urban aspect, I'd like to make first some big, obvious statements about skyscrapers and cities, then introduce my concept of the subtitle, The Logic of Vertical Density. I think I actually coined, see, I started talking off my script, and so I forgot to say, oh, we're going to talk about the future of urban tall with a question mark. So we will be talking about that, but I want to talk especially about history and put this into context. So I think I actually coined this term vertical density as it applies to cities because as you can see in the Google search string here, the Skyscraper Museum's 2008 conference with this title dominates the first list of referrals, and it does so deep into the next pages. I hope that you'll look at our website for the record of this conference and videos. There's about 8 hours worth of conference talks. I'll return to vertical density later, but first urban and urbanization. Urbanization is the dominant trend of the 21st century. We see urbanization everywhere, except arguably in the US and old Europe, and indeed Americans can be a bit blind to the process and spend a lot of time focusing on sprawl, which is the opposite of urbanization. But in China, India, Africa, South America, everywhere, as they're demonstrating, the world's future for the next century is clearly cities. Oh, here, I forgot to do the vertical density, the conference on our website. I start talking, I got out of sync with my text. So many academics, including Ricky Burdett and the others at LSE, have been making this point in their traveling conferences, the Urban Age conferences, and in this tome that you see here, the cover, The Endless City. And everywhere, as people migrate from countryside to cities, immigrate, or simply multiply on site, the problems of accommodating more people at greater density, at greater physical density, is the challenge for architects, engineers, and politicians. Modernization goes hand in hand with the urbanization process, especially as the city grows more affluent. A historical perspective suggests that the evolution of a successful city moves towards higher uses and land values that produce high-rise buildings. That was certainly true in the case of New York and in Chicago in the 1870s. This is New York with its first tall buildings. Or in Chicago, as you see here, in the early 1890s. Or when buildings rose to be about 10 or 12 stories. In the 1880s, they were about 7 or 8 stories. Or in the 1890s, when 20 stories and above became the norm, as you see here in Lower Broadway in New York. In 1913, the elegant Woolworth Building rose 55 stories and 792 feet to become the world's tallest tower. In 1915, the 40-story Equitable Building on Lower Broadway, designed by Chicago's Ernst Graham, became the world's largest office building in terms of volume of floor space at 1.2 million square feet. I mention these two New York giants of the 19-teens to remind us that tall and big are not the same thing. It's a caveat that we need to remember to keep clearly in mind in the discussion of urban tall. Since the early 20th century, towers have been stretching ever taller, but they haven't gained in girth since the 1960s and 70s, when the Sears Tower and the two World Trade Centers, with their full-acre floor plates, were designed and constructed. These colossal office towers culminated the evolution of the skyscraper in the 20th century in terms of the sheer size of interior floor space, though not of altitude, as we have seen throughout the day. You can see in this diagram here from an exhibition that the museum did in 1999 called Big Buildings, a kind of quantification of the enlargement, actually the doubling in size of a standard office building across the 20th century. So you can find this in detail on our website. But the biggest of the buildings, the World Trade Center towers with 4.5 million square feet in each one of the towers, are the largest buildings to date of that size. And as we've seen throughout today, few of the projected towers, possibly Shanghai Tower, will match that height with that volume with a single building. So if asked to predict the future of urban tall, I would say that new towers will seldom surpass or even match these 60s behemoths. The reason for this is that the new super talls are mixed-use buildings with large residential or hotel component in the upper floors that require small floor plates. Take, for example, the extraordinary Burj Dubai, which is principally a residential tower. And although it's almost 1,000 feet taller than the 1,600-plus foot buildings it passed in height, Taipei 101 and the Shanghai World Financial Center, it has about the same amount of floor space, 3 million square feet. So none of these match, as I've just said, the World Trade Center towers at 4.5 million. So the conventional narrative of the evolution of the skyscraper from small to tall, rising ever higher while simple and appealing, is only partly true. The evolution is not inexorable, and it's not open-ended, despite the papers just today on kilometer-tall towers. We need to remember that laissez-faire development is generally a temporary condition in the evolution of cities, and that size is almost always constrained, sooner or later, by culture or politics. In the US, in the early 20th century, Washington, Boston, in the early 20th century, Washington, Boston, and Philadelphia put a height limit on buildings. And so, in fact, did Chicago in 1893 until 1924. A little-known fact to most people, or at least to me in the first several years of my graduate school art history training on the research of skyscrapers. Apparently also to Mayor Daley, so he didn't mention it in his talk today. So briefly, the real estate, so I wrote about this height cap at some length in my book, Form Follows Finance. Briefly, the story is the real estate boom of the early 1890s that drove the development of architectural masterpieces of the first Chicago school by Adler and Sullivan, Burnham and Root, Holabird and Roche, and others, produced an oversupply of commercial space that concerned the owners of existing properties. These owners pressured politicians for height restrictions, and indeed in 1893, the city imposed a 130-foot height cap on tall buildings, the equivalent of about 13 or 14 stories. This limit produced the Chicago's flat-top palazzos, office blocks, as you see here, of the early 20th century, and it was moved up and down a few times between 130 and 200 feet based on market demand until a more liberal formula allowing towers was passed in 1923. During this time, New York leaped ahead of Chicago, spawning dozens of towers, 2 or 3 times taller than Chicago cubes, including the super jumbo Woolworth and Equitable buildings. So as long as we're in the 20th century, let me make also a basic point illustrated historically, but also true today. High demand for prime locations, not lack of available land, drives up rents, land values, and if permitted, building heights. There's a common and false assertion, for example, that narrow Manhattan Island produced skyscrapers because there was, quote, no room to grow out, only up. This cliche is easily refuted by a look at either the historic skyline or a map of land values, such as this amazing document of 1913 created by Richard Hurd, the author of Principles of City Land Values. Hurd's map of Lower Manhattan shows the per square foot price of property at a time before any zoning or any other municipal laws constrained the heights of buildings. As you can see, the highest land values of $300 and $400 a square foot concentrate around Wall Street, near the stock exchange and the major banks, as well as on the corridor of Lower Broadway and around City Hall. Note, though, that just 3 blocks from Wall Street, values drop precipitously. $25 a square foot, $10 a square foot. The low price reflects low demand for these off-center locations. High prices reflect high demand, and they predict high-rise buildings. There are further fundamental factors of design, construction, and financing that need a moment's attention here and that bear on the future of tall. Almost all skyscrapers are built as commercial investments. We heard Muhammad Ali Akbar speak of that, and everybody who's a developer has mentioned the financing. So we know this is true, that the key blueprints for most buildings, especially from the developer's point of view, but it impacts on everything that you do, are the balance sheets that weigh the costs of land construction against the anticipated rents. As this professional audience well knows, very tall buildings, that is above 50 or 80 stories, are more expensive to build than the shorter ones, and they require more engineering and material to counteract the wind forces, more elevators, etc. So as a consequence, in order to reap the highest rate of return, it can sometimes be more profitable for a developer to erect a shorter building than a taller one. The difference is what's known as the economic height versus the engineering height of the building, and that's what you're seeing in this 1929 study of the skyscraper, its economic height, a building that looks very much like the Empire State Building because the author of this study was Shreve of Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon. So real estate cycles, the engineering height of a building is always higher than the economic height. Real estate cycles often also change the equation of land costs or anticipated rents, and they often drive up the heights of buildings as a boom cycle progresses, and the developers, their architects, and especially their bankers become bold, greedy, or foolish, depending on your perspective. It's often true that the tallest buildings in a given cycle come at the end of a boom and are created after the crash or in a recession. But I have to add quickly that I in no way subscribe to the skyscraper index, which I think is quite ridiculous, but which has been cited at least twice over the course of the conference. I hope these brief examples will serve to convince you of my view that the future of tall will be, as in the past, dependent on economics more than engineering, and especially on the restrictions that a municipality imposes in the control of heights, building bulk ratios, floor area ratios, etc. So if it's true that urbanization and modernization are the world's future, what smart policies should cities adopt in planning the accommodation of expanding urban populations? I'd like to propose what I call the logic of vertical density. So as I noted earlier, this idea is intuitively easy to understand, but it seems never before to have been given a name by the people who study architecture and urbanism. It's an idea that I began to think about during the research of the Skyscraper Museum's 2008 exhibition, The Vertical Cities, Hong Kong, New York. This show was part of a 3-show cycle called Future City 2021, that examined visions of New York as the skyscraper city of the future in the early 20th century and used that model to explore the parallel conditions of rapid urbanization in Chinese cities today. And you still have time to see the third of the shows, China Prophecy Shanghai, which is up through March at the museum. For vertical cities, we wanted to explore the similarities between Hong Kong and New York beyond their premier skyscraper identities. We looked into the question of population density, which, as it turns out, is almost exactly the same for Manhattan and for Hong Kong, about 70,000 people a square mile. We also wanted to compare their density with other major cities of the world of 7 million or more inhabitants. However, we found the lists of the top 10 largest and densest cities to be fairly meaningless as simple statistics, because the population is divided by such hugely different variables of the area within the municipal boundaries. So we paired the statistics with aerial views of the cities. I'll show you 10 here quickly, starting with New York and Hong Kong. And for this series, so here's New York and Hong Kong, and then a series of other very large cities that I'll just show in sequence and let you absorb a little bit of them and then go back and discuss them. We used both UN sources and Wikipedia for the largest of the world and the world's densest cities, determined by their city proper municipal boundaries. And there are many, many different lists. We tried to make this as intelligent as we could, but we thought with pairing the images with the calculations that we got a much better sense of what density looks like. So I hope you'll agree with me from this series of images that the images communicate much better the density than do the statistics. But together, the photos and the numbers do make clear that urban density has two dramatically different expressions in many world cities, one in the ground plane, the other in the skyline. The world's densest major cities, Hong Kong, Cairo, and Mumbai, represent wildly disparate models of urban development in the vertical and the horizontal dimensions. Cairo and Mumbai have average densities of 96,000 and 56,000 people per square mile. But their extreme concentrations are spread homogeneously in low-rise buildings in an environment of crowding and congestion. Their horizontal density also correlates with poverty. On the other hand, Hong Kong and Manhattan, New York City, so Hong Kong and Manhattan represent, with their 70,000 people a square mile, suggest that high density, that is vertical density, can correlate with affluence. So as I go forward, just let you look at them again. You're looking at square kilometers rather than square miles, which is what I'm using as a measure for the discussion. But just to look again at the character of these cities to try to get a sense visually of what urban density looks like. So the photos of Hong Kong and Manhattan can help us to understand what extreme vertical density looks like, but the number 70,000 people a square mile needs further explanation. Manhattan is easy. It's 1.6 million people living on an island that's 23 square miles, giving an average density of about 71,000 people a square mile. Across the 5 boroughs, though, is what you saw on the average before. New York's average density is 27,000 people a square mile. So that's the number that you see below here. Now, Hong Kong is much more complicated. Hong Kong, so I need to explain these numbers a little bit because we really sort of created them ourselves in our research, but from good sources. Hong Kong's population is 7 million people, averaged over the full area of the Special Administrative Region, the SAR. It's of 426 miles, would yield a population density of 17,000 people a square mile. However, more than 3/4 of Hong Kong's area is preserved as country park, as natural terrain, which is the verdant mountainsides and the natural landscape. So the cumulative built area of the SAR is limited to 100 square miles, and the population is 7 million, therefore an average of 70,000 people a square mile. Some areas of Kowloon are much more dense, from 90,000 to 110,000 people a square mile, so I think it's fair to use the 70,000 number. Sorry. So Hong Kong does not have sprawl. The government owns all the land and leases it for development. And by policy, which includes a market strategy to keep land prices high, Hong Kong concentrates its people on 23% of the land. Using the land rail model for transit-based development, even the master plan towns of the new territories that you're seeing here are designed as skyscraper communities of 40, 50, or 60-story towers. Throughout Hong Kong SAR and across income levels, from public housing to luxury towers, an average of 250 units per acre in large-scale development is common. In Hong Kong, the city grows up, not out, because of government policy. So now clearly Hong Kong government couldn't command high land prices if there was no market for development and no money in the system. Likewise for Manhattan and lots of other places with dramatic skylines. Prices for commercial real estate and apartments in Hong Kong and Manhattan are among the very highest in the world. And that's because a lot of well-to-do people live there in these successful global cities. So now I think I'm saying something. This is the view from my apartment in Manhattan. So I think I'm saying something here which is extremely obvious, and probably so do you. But there are a lot of people, especially in New York, who understand that the term density only as a pejorative. In general parlance, in the press, in civic conversations, density means crowding. It's considered a negative condition. Likewise, new tall buildings are almost always protested for casting shadows and stealing light, for blocking views, for breaking the scale and the context of existing neighborhoods. Upzoning, allowing more buildable volume on a lot, which is generally translated into building height, is seldom accomplished in New York because of community opposition. I've even heard neighborhood advocates denounce upzoning as racism. So in my view, there's an absolute illogic to these views about the ill effects of high density and tall buildings. In urban terms, we should understand density, and here I mean good vertical density, not as low-rise congestion and crowding, but as vitality. People flock to dense urban centers for their panoply of offerings and opportunities. People desire to live in Manhattan or in Midtown or anywhere Manhattan or in Hong Kong's mid-levels, and they pay a very high price to do so. The same is true for office rents. Market forces define these places as successful. So what's my point? Don't think that I'm arguing for 70,000 people a square mile everywhere, or that there's a blanket prescription that we must have high density, or that, certainly not, that density will actually produce affluence. But this paper is more simply an appeal for a clearer thinking about what tall buildings and density and what they are and what we consider of them in the future. So cities are gaining in population, and planners need to address this growth. Mayor Daley gave a wonderful talk to signal how Chicago is doing that. In New York, the Bloomberg administration's Plan 2030 intelligently assumes that the city will grow from its current 8.25 million people to 9 million people over the next 20 years. So where will they live? Nobody's going to want to crowd together more closely, and indeed affluent people will undoubtedly want to buy themselves more personal living space. This is simple arithmetic. Cities will become statistically more dense. How then will these numbers be accommodated? By horizontal crowding? By sprawl? To me, it's clear that the logic points to vertical density. Vertical density can also liberate more of the ground plane to make room for shared public space. See a few different New York Bryant Park and Central Park amenities. And Little Paley Park. Fortunately, it's becoming clear to people all the time that cities offer the promise of a more sustainable future. Climate change is an urgent danger, and urbanites consume less energy per capita than those who live in single-family homes in the suburbs. Municipal governments that pay attention to sustainable policies, as Mayor Daley showed us, can make cities even more energy efficient. So to reiterate and to conclude, the world is urbanizing, and we have to figure out how to deal with this reality. This is not a new issue. As the cartoon here of predicting New York in 1999, which was made for a newspaper in 1899, shows us. It amuses me that this recent view of Shanghai seems to bear such an uncanny similarity to the cartoon. So the process of urbanization and modernization in Shanghai and in many Chinese cities, in the Mideast and the other places we've been seeing throughout the speakers in this conference, is happening at the rate that condenses and accelerates everything that we've seen historically. I'm pleased that I'm not the first person at the podium to be emphasizing cities and density. There have been quite a few people who have mentioned this and spoken of it passionately. But it's clear that we should talk much more about cities generally and vertical density in particular. That is urban density that's created in conjunction with great mass transit, with ample public space, and that this will be the intelligent solution for sustainable living for expanding populations and urbanizing nations. Thanks.